So today is lesson 11. We're in the home stretch. Let's just have a quick look at what we've got coming up. Just back out here. So we've basically got 3 more lessons together and then our final exam. So what we're going to do over the next 3 classes is we're going to work on a new application. We basically are going to rebuild our NodeTunes application, but we're going to kind of deconstruct it and rebuild it into 2 separate applications. A server app that's basically going to be a REST API. We're going to use Node and Express for that. And there's not going to be any views at all in that application. We're going to build a client-side application using the Angular CLI, and then we're going to have them talk together. So the goal is we will be able to perform create, read, update, and delete with our music library on a single page that will never have to be reloaded. So we'll build that out over the next couple classes, and then our final class, we'll look at adding authentication to that backend API service. So it's not just open to any application to modify our data. We'll use JWT for creating authentication tokens, and then we'll also look at deploying the application. So it's a little bit different because in effect, we really have two separate components that we have to deploy, our server and our client. So we'll look at doing that over the next few weeks. To give you a little preview, I've been kind of playing around with this. I've done this, built this app in the past, but I always update it. So I've spent lots of time knee deep in this. I was actually having dreams about Angular components last night. So when we're done, it's going to look something sort of like this. So I built out a sample. So we're going to have our artist list displaying here. We can display the albums underneath. And then if I want to add a new artist, my list updates automatically without our page having to reload. And then if I want to select the artist, I could either edit them or I can delete them. And again, our list updates. So we're using Angular for the front end. You'll notice it's running on the default Angular port of 4200. And our back end is a separate application, separate project entirely, and it's just serving as an API where it can take calls in that are made from the Angular application. Okay, so this is where we're going. We'll start building this today. I think the goal today would be to get the 2 applications set up and at least be able to display artists and maybe add a new artist. And then we'll move on and implement delete and update next week. And then we'll look at adding authentication in the backend API as well as our server deployment. Okay, so this is kind of giving you a preview of what we want to build out. Both of those, because I've still got my samples running. So I'm going to stop both of them. Okay, so we're basically going to re-architect. Okay, so we're going to look at how Angular and Node talk to each other. So we're going to build a server API with Node and Express and a separate Angular front end that can communicate with that API. So when we built our original NodeTunes application, right, it was functional. We could do create, read, update, and delete operations through our Express controller and our Mongoose-based model. So we really had 3 layers, right? We had MongoDB on the back end. We had Node and Express Node to run our website and Express for our controller. So we sort of had 3 layers. As well, I guess we had a view layer using handlebars templating. So what we're going to do when we recreate this, so the idea is we're trying to create an SPA, a single page application. So we're creating a kind of a better user experience where everything happens on one page. So it's faster, it's higher performance, a better user experience. So we're going to be breaking our existing application down into two separate components. We're going to have a server, and which will use our database and our Mongoose models. And then we're going to redevelop our controller as a REST API. So it's not going to render any views. The API is simply going to send and receive JSON, but we'll use express routing. And then we'll build using the Angular CLI. We're going to have 3 layers within our Angular application. We've got the services layer, and that's designed to interface with the backend API. We've got our Angular component layer that has our front-end logic. And then we have the actual view layer, which will be HTML files with Angular directives. So we're going from an app that had 4 layers to 2 separate apps with 3 layers each. So it means we'll need a fair bit more code and it'd be more complex, but ultimately we're looking to create a better, richer application. So we're going to have 2 separate apps running, our backend that runs on port 3000 and our Angular client that runs on port 4200. So we're going to start off today by rebuilding the backend. So we're going to use the Express generator to make a new project. We're going to copy a few of the items, like our model and our database connection. We can copy out of our existing project and reuse those files, but then we're going to rewrite our controller. So let's open up our code editor. And I'm going to do 2 things here. Let's just move these over here, because I may want to refer to them. Okay, so I'm going to open up my Node Tunes project. I don't need to run it. I'm just going to open it up because we want to copy a few of the files that we have here into our new application. But first, we need to use the Express generator to set up the new application. So I'm going to go to my terminal. And I'm just going to go back to my main WebStorm directory where I've been creating all of the projects in our class. So I'm going to run the command express. What will we call this? We'll call this node tunes SPA server. So SPA, again, single page application. So I'm going to use the express generator to build a new project with the name node tunes SPA server. I don't need to bother with that -h or views equal minus views because we don't care about the views. We're not actually going to use any of the views in here. And then it tells me, okay, change directories, do cd into our new folder, and then run npm install, which I will do. So now I'll just run npm I. So this just gives us the kind of generic Express generator project. We've got some warnings about the view engine being deprecated. We don't care about that. We're not going to use the view engine. Now our server project, it needs to talk to the database, so we need Mongoose. We will install Mongoose in here as well. And now I'm going to open up my new project, but I'm going to open it in a new window. I want to keep the existing project open for a little bit so that we can copy some of the files. that we're going to need. So now I'll click on File and Open. So I'm going to open my NodeTunes SPA server. Usually I just say this window. Typically I have one project open at a time. This time I'm going to pick New Window. So here's our new project. So the first thing I want here, I want to copy a couple of items from the original NodeTunes. I want the globals folder, sorry, the config and globe folder with the globals file, because it's got our database connection. We're going to use the same database. I also will want the artist model. So I'm going to create config and models, and then I'm going to create the two files here, the globals.js and the artist.js. So first I will make a new directory called config. And inside of here, I will recreate my file called globals. So go ahead and create that folder and file. And then I'm just going to copy and paste my globals content file from the old project. So here's our globals. I won't need the GitHub login, so I can remove that, but I'll just, for the moment, copy everything in my globals file. I'm going to dump it in here. And I'm going to remove, we will need to make another change here, but I don't need the GitHub login, so I'm just going to take it out. So all I need is my database connection. I'm basically going to repeat that process with our models folder and our artist model. So again, I'm going to make a new directory called models. I'll make a new JavaScript file called artist. And then I'll jump back over to our old project and just copy and paste the contents of the artist class. So I'm just going to copy it and paste it. So we're importing the Mongoose library. We're setting up an artist schema. I probably also should change this to a const. Makes my code editor a little happier. And we are exporting it publicly with the name artist with a capital A. So again, I've just copied over my config globals and my models artist. I also prefer to rename, I hate this name called routes. This is actually the controllers. I'm going to refactor and rename the routes folder and any references. I'm going to modify it to controllers. This is just personal preference. You don't have to do this. I prefer that that's called controllers. There's one more item or some code. It's not a full file. I want to copy the database connection code that we have in our app.js. So right now, when we run the NodeTunes app, as soon as the app runs, it tries to use our database connection and connect to MongoDB. So same thing in our server. Our NodeTunes server, when it runs, we want that database connection to be available. I'm going to go back to NodeTunes, and I'll open up app.js. So I need to reference our globals file because it has our connection string. So I'll add this reference. Which I'll copy to my app.js of the new project. And then there's a few lines of code, probably six to 10 lines of code further down that uses our configuration to connect to MongoDB. So in my app.js, where did we do it? We did it down here. So when our app runs, it uses that connection string and tries to connect and prints a message. So I will copy that as well. And again, I'll put it down here above the 404 error handling. So we'll link to Mongoose and we'll call the connect method with our database connection string. So this should be everything that we need from here. I'm going to use NodeMon now. I should be able to load. I want to try to run my server application. So I'll use NodeMon. It says I'm connected. Now I can hit localhost 3000 and it just kind of loads the Express template. So it shouldn't be, I don't think, anything too complicated so far. Right, we've just used the generator. We've copied over a couple of files in our database connection. Everybody with me? Any problems or questions so far? I know we're a small group today. You guys are pretty sharp. All right, cool. Thanks, Chris. So now we're going to recreate, but it's not going to be a copy paste. We now want to create the artist's controller. So I'm going to, in my controllers folder, I'm going to make a new JavaScript file called artists, plural, all lowercase. So we need to add in our dependencies. So we're going to require Express. We're going to create an Express router. So the same code we've put in our other controllers. And we also need our model. Because in order for our controller to interact with the database, all of those transactions get passed through the model that uses Mongoose. Okay, so there are references. So we're going to write a simple get method that runs at that. Actually, I guess it's going to be this. So this is going to be the path for all of the endpoints in our API. So we'll have our usual Express request and response callback. And we'll keep it simple. We'll call artist.find. And when we do that, we will either get an error or a list of artists. So far this code is actually identical to what we had in our original project. The difference, I'll just save this for a moment. I'm going to go and look at the original get method in our first controller. So when the path came in at the root, we had a request response callback. We called artist.find, which returns either an error or an array. And we said if we got an error, we were going to log it and send the error back. Otherwise, we were going to render the view called artist index and pass in the data so we could display it. Now, in this case, we're simply building an API. There is no front end. So this is going to be a little different. So if we have an error, in this case, yes, we can log it. And we are simply going to send all our responses as JSON. So we're sending the error back as an JSON object. And we'll send a 400 status code, which means bad request in HTTP. Otherwise, we're going to send back our artist data also in JSON format. So all of the methods in our controller, they're just going to return JSON. We're not rendering any views. And in this case, we'll send a 200 OK status. So we will fetch lists of artists, return either 400 bad request or 200 OK along with JSON response. And then we want to make this public. So we're going to export our router so it's public. So we can actually try this in our browser. So let's see. I'll go to localhost 3000 /API /artists. And we get a 404. Okay, that wasn't part of the plan. Why'd this happen? How come our controller method, which is supposed to go and fetch the artist data and return it in JSON, why didn't it get invoked? I'll give you a hint. There's actually nothing wrong with the code in the controller. Thank you, Chris. We haven't referenced it, and we haven't pointed any URL pattern, any route to this controller. So we'll need to go to our app.js. We've got to reference our controller, and we'll have to point this URL. Any requests that start with this URL should be handled here. We'll go back to app.js. Right, we have these two controllers declared. Oops, sorry. They're declared up here. So say const artist controller. So we will reference the controller here. So I've added line 9. And then our URL prefix will be /API/artists. So we're pointing any HTTP requests that come in at this URL, we're saying send those to our artist controller. So now if I refresh, here's the artists. If we want to see the raw data, it looks like this. Firefox knows I've got JSON data, so it gives us actually a JSON, nice little JSON reader. So a very simple API, 90% of what we've got here is exactly the same as what we had in our node tunes. The only thing that's different really is how we're handling the response. We're not sending back a view, we're simply sending back a JSON object. And I should be able to see in my browser console as well that our status is 200 or OK. Right, so it shows me a 200 OK response here. So we're actually going to leave the server app for now. We'll come back here later. We'll need to write a post method later on. If we can create a new artist in our front end and send that artist object in here, we'll need to save it to our database. But we're going to leave the server now. We want to start to build our client front end using Angular. And then we'll want to connect them up so that the Angular application can actually start to display this JSON data. So let's start here. So I'm going to leave this running. I'll go back to my original Node Tunes application. And I'm going to go down here to the terminal. I'm now inside of my server app. I now want to use the Angular CLI to build a new Angular application. So I'm going to do cd ... to get out of my server project and just back to my main root folder. And now I want to use the Angular CLI to build our front-end project. So we'll do ng new, and I'll call it Node Tunes SPA client. Okay, so we're using the Express generator to build the server backend, and we're using the Angular CLI to build our front end. So ng new Node Tunes SPA client. I will say yes to Angular routing. I mean, we don't necessarily need it because we only have one page. So routing is generally so we can parse different URLs and direct them to different places. So probably not essential, but we'll add it just in case we decide we need it later. Style sheet format defaults to plain CSS, so I'll just hit enter. And I'll let the CLI run so that it can build our Angular app. Morning, Jillian, didn't see you come in. Okay, so now our Angular project Yes, I missed you in the list. So now I want to change directories. I'm going to enter my Node Tunes SPA client. And then I'm also going to open up the project in my current window. So now I've got both projects. I'll open it up in this window. We don't really need much in the original Node Tunes project, at least not for now. So this project, if I launch it, if I run it, it's going to look exactly like the original Angular template that we generated last week. So we can start with that. We'll just get it launched. So we can run ng serve --o. That's going to start the server as well as open the application in a new browser tab. So do ng serve --o. So take a minute to compile and run. Okay. So it says our client app is running. So now we can see our server app is still running, right? We can make requests to the API. And our client app is running. We've got all this kind of template code here. So our next step is, like we did last week, we're going to use this ng generate component. We're going to want to build an Angular component. And that's going to give us several files. It's going to give us an HTML file that we'll use to eventually make look something like this. It's also going to give us a TypeScript file where we can write the logic for our Angular component. Okay, Adam, if it seems hung up, you may have to kill it and try it again. I've had that experience too. Technology, okay, yeah, your technology has not been your friend lately. Okay, so I've got the client running now. But now we want to run a generate component command. So in my code editor, and you can do this in Visual Studio Code, right? I'm going to create a second terminal. So I can leave this one running. I don't have to stop my server. Just click on new session here. I'm still inside my client. And now I can run ng generate component. We'll call it artist. So this will build the TypeScript file for the logic. It will build the HTML file for the web page. It'll include a CSS file, and it will also automatically add a reference to this component in our, we'll see it get added to our app.module.ts. So let's run that command, ng generate component artist, and hit enter. And now we've got this artist folder that's added. And if I open up under source and app, if I open up app.module.ts, which is like our kind of like our startup file here, it automatically imports our component and declares it here. If we go and look at the HTML template, so it generated artist.component.html. When we open it up, it just has a paragraph tag that says artist works. So we want to modify our application now. So when the application loads, right now it loads the loads this app component file instead. Right? We've got all this HTML, this really long file with a whole pile of HTML. And there's two places. So we want to replace this file so that when our app runs on localhost 4200, it just shows our artist component. That right now just has a little paragraph tag that says artist works. Does anybody remember there are actually two places we have to go to make that change? So we don't want this showing up when we run our app. We just want this little page here showing up. So we have to change two files in order to get that to work. Anybody remember from last week? We did this last week with our first Angular app. Where did we go to change the startup component? Cool if you want to guess. There will be no beatings for wrong answers. Okay, so Jason said app routing. Let's have a look. And Adam said index.html. Okay, let's open up the app routing. That's a good guess, Jason. It's not actually here. So the app routing is if we want to set up different URL paths. We would do that here. But excellent guess. Right, Adam, this is one place. So in index.html, which line do we want to change so that our artist component will show up instead of all that kind of template text that Angular gives us? We want to change one of these lines. Yeah, you got it, Reden. So app root, right, that refers to this component. The default, it's got this selector of app root. So Reden, I'll ask you, here's our artist component. So what should we change app root to? Yeah, exactly. Good, almost, right? Our selector is here. We're going to change it to the app artist selector instead. So in index.html, which we find here, right? And Angular, my code editor, it recognizes this tag. So now we've got app artist. So I'm going to change the word root to artist. We'll go back to the browser and check it out. Okay. Sort of worked. I mean, it partly worked. It got rid of the app root, right? We don't see that HTML page. The job's only half done. So we've put our tag here, but there's one other place we need to change, which is in this app.module.ts file. So this is like our application, our Angular application startup file. Can anybody want to take a guess? Which line number do we need to change here as well? Thank you, Adam. So in Bootstrap, this is like the startup component. It's still defaulting. So now nothing shows because we've got this disconnect. Our TypeScript is saying the app component should be our startup file, but our index.html is saying our artist component should be the startup. So we need to make that consistent. So I'm going to change the Bootstrap from app component to artist component. Okay, so we actually have to change it in two places, both in app.module.ts as well as the tag in our index.html. So now, when I go back to the browser, now our artist component is showing up. We'll leave the app component alone. We don't really need it. So we're going to start making some changes. so that our app starts to look more like this one. So we'll make some changes to the artist component.html and some other changes even to our index.html. So one of the things we want to change here is we want to change the page title. So right now it says No Tunes SPA Client. Just takes our project name and removes the spaces. So first of all, in our index.html, let's change the title to Node Tunes SPA. Now, we also want to add Bootstrap back in and maybe the Google font that we had in our original project. So let's go ahead and grab those things. We'll get the Bootstrap. We can use the CDN. So I will copy those. So you can just go here. I'll put the link in the chat. So if we're going to go and get Bootstrap 5, I'll copy this, skip the download to deliver a cached version. So I'm going to copy that. And paste those in. So once I do that, we'll see the font, my font changes here. And then I also want to go and grab the same Google font we were using in our Node Tunes project originally. So I'll just go to my GitHub repo. I'll just throw these in the chat. Here was our Node Tunes. So in our layout file, we linked to the Nanito Google font, and then we set that font as the default in our style sheet. So I've put those links in the chat. I'm just going to copy them back in. So I'll copy those into our index.html. And then we do have, even though every page has its own style sheet, some Angular developers like, I don't like, we also have a general style sheet here. And we also defined that font as well originally. So I'll just grab those classes that set our font to Nanito. So I'm just going to paste them into styles.css. And now we could add a little bit of styling to our artist component. First of all, I don't want this to be a paragraph. We'll make this an H1 and maybe have it, call it Node Tunes Single page application, SPA. Okay, so now it looks like this. We've got our Nonito font back. We've got our H1. And then we're going to set up a section to display the artists from our server backend. So eventually we'll split this form, but we'll just deal with the left side of the page first. We'll add in the details form later. Okay, so let's go back to our editor here. So we're going to create a row class. So that's going to allow us to put these two divs side by side, our list on the left and our form on the right. So I'll use Bootstrap to kind of format this. Our first will be 5 columns wide. We'll give it a gray background with BG light, a little margin, and a little padding. And here we'll put on an H2 that says artists. I'll copy that. And in our second div over on the right, the subheading will say details. Okay, so now it's split into 2 gray boxes. Yeah, I should, Jillian, I guess it would, well, it defaults to sans serif. So if it can't find that font, it degrades to, this is why we always just declare like a system font as an alternate. So if I was offline, that's what would happen. Okay, so at full scale now we've got, I know it's kind of hard to see on my screen, but I got a little gray shading. So our page is split. Okay, I think we're in pretty good shape. So what we want to do now is we're going to need to go through these 3 layers. So we started to build our component and view, but we're now going to need to add an artist service to the Angular app. We'll do this when we come back. So the service is the interface between the Angular front end and our server backend. It's going to make calls to our REST API and send and receive JSON from our server. It can then hand the data to the component, and then we can render the list of artists in the views. Okay, so this is where we're going. I'll need a minute. I will put everything we've done up on GitHub, but I need a couple minutes to do it because I actually have 2 separate projects, right? The server and the client. So I'm going to push both of them separately to GitHub. So give me a few minutes. I'm going to stop the recording and upload to GitHub, and we will come back at 12:05.